This is the third and final video in this series of videos I've been doing over this past week, in which I admit to myself that these three books on my reading list that I've started for professional development, I'm not going to finish. Or at least I'm not going to finish them now. All of them I'm still somewhat interested in. I may restart them at some point, but I'm clearing out my reading list now. So the first video I did was on the Encyclopedia of the English Language. Then I did the grammar book, and I'll link to both of those videos in the description down below if you missed them. But today I'm saying goodbye to Teaching Reading Skills in a Foreign Language by Christine Nuttall. So this is a book that I started reading in the summer of 2022, 2 years ago now, and got about halfway through it before I stalled out on it. The intent was always to come back to it, which is why I've waited 2 years before filming this video. It's a library book, so it actually came due some time ago, and I actually returned it to the library, I guess about, a year and a half ago now. But did not take it off of my currently reading list. The intention was always to come back to the library and check it out again and pick up where I left off. But I never did. I actually checked this book out of the library again just this past week, just for the purposes of making this video. There are 2 copies in my school library. I'm not sure if this was the same copy I was reading earlier or not, but I don't notice any substantial differences. Anyways, this is all about a book about teaching reading skills in a foreign language. 2 years ago, one of my professional development goals was to acquire a bunch of new activities for reading lessons. I like to think of it of activities that can be used for any reading text. The reason is I was worried my reading lessons were getting a little bit dry and stagnant. The reading lessons would just consist of asking the students to answer the exercises in the textbook. These ESL textbooks. There's a reading, and then there's comprehension questions after the reading. And I would do the lead-in and the communicative follow-up and all the stuff you're supposed to do with a reading lesson. But in terms of the actual reading activities themselves, I would just use the comprehension questions from the textbook. And I wanted to find out different ways I could exploit the reading texts. And so that was one of my professional development goals 2 years ago. And as such, I went to my school library to see which books they had on the teaching of reading. And this, actually, I think there was one other book that my manager had recommended to me. Maybe it was How to Teach Reading. But it was checked out of the library at that time. So I picked this one up instead. And yeah, teaching reading skills in a foreign language, this still fits the bill. But I mentioned that maybe to come clean and admit that my purposes for reading this book were a little bit at cross purposes for how this book was meant to be read, or at least how it was written. So I was hoping to go through it and mine it for interesting activities I could use in the classroom. But the book is much more of a comprehensive theoretical approach to learning reading. So, what is reading? Text and discourse. All of part 1 is just analyzing what the skill of reading is before we even get to reading skills and strategies. Nevertheless, I did get a couple good ideas out of this book. They were not things that had been they were not always activities that had been mentioned directly in the book. Some of them were skills that Christine Nuttall being the author, said were important, and I thought of activities off of that. And two activities that were loosely inspired by this book was one where you cut out the paragraph cut out one sentence from each paragraph and see if the students can spot where a sentence is missing. This is to see if they can spot where there's a gap in the coherence of the text. And the other activity is when students are given a map of the functions of each sentence in a text, and they have to match the sentences to the function. And I'll link to both of those activities from my blog in the description to this video down below. There is, however, let me see if I can find it. There's a quote here when she talks about reading skills that I really like. Yeah, it's something over here. Yeah, here we go. The problem of credibility. It says, it is difficult to convince people that problems can arise from bits of the text they are hardly aware of. Some of the strategies required, e.g. working out what reference words like it and this refer to, may be dismissed unless the practice material offers genuine difficulties. It is important not to work on a skill unless you can demonstrate that problems occur. And then skipping down here, if you're not clear about the purpose of an exercise or not convinced of its value, it is better not to use it because it is easy to make training seem pointless. I thought that was a really good observation. So often when I've been teaching reading lessons over the years and years I've been teaching ESL, the textbook will say this is the reading strategy for this unit. So this reading strategy is based on reference words, or this reading strategy is based on discourse markers, or this reading strategy is based on understanding author's intent. There's always some sort of reading strategy that goes with each unit. And the students find it very boring and will almost immediately disengage. And quite often as a teacher, it's boring to teach it. And I think I and a lot of other teachers tend to think, did I really learn this when I was learning to read? I mean, I know it's different in your first and second language, but I just learned how to read by comprehending it. I didn't have to go through all these reading strategies. So I've become very disillusioned with all the reading strategies that are always included in each unit of the textbook. And I think some of this is just a marketing ploy by the publishers. Like, look, we're teaching something different in every unit. So this really struck me as a nice cold splash of common sense. If the students are not having difficulties, don't introduce a reading strategy. Just have them read the text as normal, and then when they are having difficulties with something, then it's time to bring in the reading strategies. And then she has different reading strategies here, and like I said, they're not always framed in the way of activities that you can use in the classroom, but some of these I adapted into my own activities based on the strategies she emphasized, the things that she said was important in understanding a text. One of the other big things I took away from this book, and I don't remember which page this was on now. Apologies, I've forgotten the page number. But at some point when talking about setting up an extensive reading program and the importance of encouraging students to read, she said it's very good if the teacher themselves are intimately familiar with the books in the library, not only for the purpose of showcasing a good reader, like being a good model reader for the students to follow in terms of encouraging reading or encouraging motivation for reading, But also, the more you intimately know the books in the library, the more you're better able to guide students towards books that are appropriate to their level or appropriate to their interest. So, in my school library, I've been attempting to set up a collection of comic books. Now, the comic book component is not something Christine Nuttall talks about, at least not in the part that I read. I only got halfway through this book, and at least not to the best of my recollection. But the comic book is more based on other ideas and other authors who say that comic books are a great way to aid in reading because the pictures help with the comprehension in a foreign language. And the students can still get all the same practice with word recognition and building up fluency. So I've been helping the library to order comic books for the students to read. And based on Kristen Nuttall's observation that the teacher themselves should be intimately familiar with the material, I've also been checking these books out myself and reading them at home and reviewing them on this channel. In fact, if you've been watching this channel, you'll have seen that I've reviewed any number of comic books from my school library. Now, granted, I didn't need much of an excuse. I loved comic books as a kid. I largely got out of reading comic books as an adult, but was very happy for an excuse to get back into it. But it didn't take much to encourage me to get back into it. But that little bit much that it did take, that little bit of a push, did largely come from Christine Nuttall's comments in this book. So the book itself is, not counting appendices, about 230 some pages. I think I got about 120 pages or so in before I stopped reading. I'll confirm that number later by looking at my weekly reading vlog archive. And then there are appendices in the back, including model texts. Now these are buried in the back, but they're referenced in the main text. So especially in that beginning section, what is reading? She's sending you back to the appendices to look at different texts that illustrate different points about coherence or cohesion or the different ways that a text can be used. Now one of these, text 8, The Mountain People, is forever etched in my memory now. It's from a book, The Mountain People, from 1984 by Turnbull C., which I never heard of before, but I looked this up on the internet after reading this little excerpt. And it's about an anthropologist who lives with these mountain people in, I believe, Africa. But it describes how these parents are slowly starving their daughter to death because they've decided to allocate their resources to their other children. And how the daughter is able to get food from the anthropologist himself. It says, I took to feeding her, which is probably the cruelest thing I could have done. A gross selfishness on my part to try and solve and save, indeed, my own rapidly disappearing conscience. So on some level, he knows that the kindest thing to do would just be to let her die, but he ends up taking to feeding her. But what really kills her is that she wanted her parents to love her, and they had shut her out. And then eventually, the parents end up trapping her in the house for the purposes of starving her to death. What a depressing text to include in a book like this. And yes, I'm sure it's well written and stuff like that, but I mean, that really stuck with me and is something that has disturbed me and something I've been pondering over the past, ever since I've read it, thinking about the human nature and what people will do when resources are scarce and the relationship between parents and their children So apologies if I have now just passed this anguish on to you by bringing your attention to it. But there's one thing I remember from this book. It's that sample text at the end, which is forever now scarred in my psyche. And I think that's all I have to say about this book. So yeah, I'll call it good here. And now that I've removed these 3 books from my currently reading list, I may start thinking about what I want to replace them with. Am I going to still do professional development? Possibly, but maybe trying a book that's a little bit easier to read next time. Stay tuned for that one.